All right. So the Stephen Jay Gould article in our textbooks is actually part of a larger book that he wrote called Bully for Brontosaurus, and we just have the prologue assigned for this week. And I wanted to talk about the importance of this article and also some of the inspirational things that I found within it to argue that perhaps you might consider reading this textbook in the future. Or not, it's not a textbook. It's just an interesting read. So Stephen Jay Gould is right here. He is an American psychologist or paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. So he's got some interesting background in the sciences. And his lifelong pursuit is to captivate his readers with his science. So this is something that a lot of authors strive to do, but not necessarily scientists. So he's pretty unique and a very interesting guy. So he's written over 300 articles for Natural History Museum magazine, while also teaching and working at Harvard. So he's got a lot of experience in this, and I think he has some good advice for you guys as you start your first, perhaps, experience with science writing. So the three principles that I like to highlight include no compromises with conceptual richness when trying to write for audiences when you're a science writer. So making sure that you're still bringing in that storytelling component, some creativity, some interesting pieces that can capture your audience. So you keep that richness. But also no bypassing of ambiguity or ignorance. So making sure that you're not assuming your readers know too much or speaking down to them and explaining too much. So this is a very fine line that we have to practice walking. And then removal of jargon, but no dumbing down of ideas. Making sure that you're not saying, specific abbreviated terms or something that's more complex when you can say it in simpler terms. So making sure to think about that as you're writing. In your first draft, you don't necessarily have to. We can go back and say, okay, we're going to need to explain this in simpler terms or pick a new word for this. But as we're revising, that will be one of the things that we look for. So Gould says that there is a need for popular science writing, which he was early to this idea. Now it's pretty well accepted that this is an issue that we need to solve, which is why many of you have opted to take this course or your advisors have said it's a good idea to take this course. So the need is that millions of Americans are eager for intellectual stimulation without patronization, so making sure that they feel comfortable entering into this reading document text conversation with you as the author, but that they feel like it's their choice, like they're being spoken to at their level, and like it's telling them how this topic is related to their life specifically. Also thinking about the large portions of older populations. This means people in their 80s and 90s that are still striving as intensely as ever to grasp nature's richness and add to a lifetime of understanding. So we don't want to exclude this audience, especially in Scientific American. That's a huge demographic that they sell to. So be keeping that in the back of your mind that they are a little bit older. Perhaps they do have science degrees, but might not remember certain things or might not know the current research that's being studied. So you might address some of the historical research and how it's changed today, or thinking about how you can re-educate them on concepts that perhaps have changed since their time at school or maybe are new. And then any conceptual complexity can be conveyed in ordinary English. So this means that you have to be very good at defining these terms and able to explain them in a simpler way. You have to know exactly what they are so that you can say them to someone who doesn't know in simple English. It doesn't mean that it has to be complex, but really breaking it down for them. One of the quotes from his prologue is that nothing more noble than the history of our struggle to understand nature, a majestic entity of such vast spatial and temporal scope that she cannot care much for a little mammalian afterthought with a curious evolutionary invention, even if that invention has, for the first time in some 4 billion years of life on Earth, Produced recursions as a creature reflects back upon its own production and evolution. Thus I love nature primarily for the puzzles and intellectual delights she offers, to the first organ capable of such curious contemplation. And here you see his passion, his creativity, his capacity for storytelling merged with the sciences. He's really thinking about how amazing this is when you think of nature as a whole, how much time has been spent on Earth creating this, and thinking about it as a puzzle and a delight, something that people can relate to and then say, yeah, that is something that's amazing. That is something worth reading about, something worth sharing, something worth talking about. So Gould also had some very interesting thoughts on the environment. And I say this because this is a really good topic that a lot of students write about, especially right now. And it's difficult because there's very different views and there's very strong opinions regarding the environment. And so I wanted to capture his explanation of it to show you a new way of entering into this conversation from his perspective. So he says, in human timescales, we are powerless to harm. The planet will take care of itself, our puny foolishness notwithstanding. But we can surely eliminate our fragile selves, and our well-buffered Earth might then breathe a metaphorical sigh of relief at the ultimate failure of an interesting but dangerous experiment in consciousness. So again, he makes the reader feel like this science is much bigger than themselves, which puts them in a perspective of awe and creates this more open, accepting perspective for the reader so that they don't feel as offended or intimidated, but they feel open and welcome to think about these concepts in a new way, no matter what side of the argument they're on. He then says, we should be so powerful. And we want to read this sentence as a derisive statement about our false sense of might, not as a literal statement of desire. So how words are chosen, how they're intended, how they're interpreted, all of these things will affect the way that your readers read, respond, and learn from your science and your writing. So these are things that we want to start thinking about. Another quote from his prologue is that human brain power, for reasons quite unrelated to its evolutionary origin, has the darndest capacity to discover the most fascinating things and think the most peculiar thoughts. So why not keep this interesting experiment around, at least for another planetary second or two? So here he's arguing that we could do a little bit to help the planet to keep this experiment going, if not for our own selfish needs, but because looking at it from a larger picture, this is something very rare and unique. He does this in a way that makes people think of their lives from a new viewpoint. So he's bringing in these concepts, these ideas, he's asking questions. He's not necessarily giving the answer, but he's letting the reader decide for themselves, which is something that you'll want to do as a successful science writer, giving them evidence and then letting them choose for themselves rather than telling them what they should do or shouldn't do. So here again is the book. If you do have time, some time down the road to read it, I highly recommend it. And I hope that this has been helpful in understanding the prologue and its purpose for this course so far.